much like how you ended up in that scenario where you were kidnapped by those two people.
Okay. I became an FBI agent in roughly the summer of 1962, and after completing the academy, I was assigned to my first office. The Bureau moves you around like the military does from base to base, but we go from city to city. And my first office was in Detroit, and I was a brand new agent out of the academy in Detroit, and I was assigned to a squad, basically what you would call today a white-collar squad, mainly crimes against an organization rather than crimes against an individual. So they traditionally are con-type things. Largely what I was involved in was the checks. Somebody writes a bad check, uses a fraudulent name on a check, sometimes counterfeits checks. And the way you start those investigations, you go and try to retrieve the original document. And I had gone to a bank to retrieve the checks involved in scams like this. And I got to a bank at approximately, banks usually opened at 9 o'clock, and say I got there at, say, half an hour early. And the bank wasn't open, so I was in a bureau car. And it was in the winter. I don't recall the month, but it was snow and ice on the ground. And so I was in the car reviewing my notes that I was going to do in the interview, similar to what you did before you set this up. And while I was in the car reviewing my notes, I wasn't paying attention like I should have. My surrounding territory. I was paying attention to the documents I was reviewing. And so I don't know where they came from. But I was parked within a short distance of the bank, probably 2 or 3 cars. And while I was in the car, both car doors open. Again, I learned I didn't have the doors locked.
Mm-hmm. So were you in the back seat?
No, I was in the driver's seat. Mm-hmm. And both doors open, and a guy got it on both sides, 2 guys, with guns, and said, "Move over." And needless to say, though I was armed, I had a gun on my belt. I'm behind a steering wheel, like, on a chair, you couldn't even get to a gun. So I did exactly what I was told, and I moved over to the seat. It was in a sedan, so I didn't have the hump in the car like most cars have today. I just slid right over to the middle of the seat. Both guys got in and had the guns. The driver, I don't know what he did with his gun, stuck in his belt or whatever, but he took the wheel and started the car up. The other guy had the gun on me. When the car was started, not only did the engine turn on, but the FBI radio system came on, and he heard the radios. And he said, "Are you a cop?" No, I said, "No, but I'm law enforcement." And at that point, they started searching me, and they found my gun, and realized I was not who they thought that I was. In retrospect, I think what they thought, since I was carrying a briefcase, they thought I was a bank messenger delivering money to the bank, waiting for the bank to open, and they thought my briefcase would be full of money. And it turns out that was all wrong, and they didn't get who they wanted to get. So they wanted to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. The car's running now, they just gun out and go a couple blocks down the street, turn into an alley. Drive me up an alley. The guy on the passenger side gets out and says, "Get out." I got out, and they said, "Go ahead and walk back down the alley." And so I started going down the alley, and as soon as I got to the first light pole, I turned and ran, because I thought they were going to shoot. They didn't shoot. They just cranked out and tore out of the place. And after that happened, I'm now no gun. I look around and find on the corner about a half a block away a store with a telephone. And those days they had to pay telephones. You put the money in the coins. Then I called my office and have to report it happened. And the first thing I do is I ask for my supervisor. Logical place. And the bureau is divided by squads, with each squad having a supervisor, each squad doing a certain type of crime. Again, I mentioned I was a white-collar crime. I called for my supervisor. And this is now Still coffee time in the morning. Well, I get the secretary to my supervisor, and she says, well, he's out having coffee. And I said, okay, transfer me to the boss of the division. Call the boss of the division. I get the secretary there, and she says the same thing. He's out having coffee with my supervisor. So I said, well, here's my problem. And they get the supervisor on the phone. And I say, hey, Henry Gaidis, I was at a bank and I got held up and they stole my car. And then he stops. He says, wait a minute, let me get a pencil and paper. And he gets my name and he writes his name down. And I don't think he recognized the name because I'm a brand new agent. And he says, what bank are you with? I said, no, I'm one of yours. And the quote was, oh shit, don't move. He had gotten where I was located. So he hung up the phone, and within 5 minutes, the corner that I was at in that little store, there were probably 20 police cars there. Detroit City Police, Wayne County Sheriff's Office, FBI cars, a couple Secret Service cars show up. They must have put over the radio system, officer in distress. So every police department in the city converged there. And then from there, I was taken back to the office and interviewed, but what they did is a complete search of the neighborhood. They found my car abandoned about 2 blocks from where they dumped me because they wanted to get out of there. And so that was the end of me being involved in it. But they did have me go through books of prior arrest records and things like this. And I came up with a guy I thought was a lookalike. But when they had me move into the center of the seat, the first thing they said is, close your eyes, don't open your eyes. And so I only had a glimpse getting into the car and when he threw me out. So no more than a couple seconds. But I picked a guy, I said, this is about what the guy looked like. And when I got out, I had an idea of the height of the guy on the passenger side. So I couldn't give an estimate on how tall the guy was on the driver's side. But the guy who I picked out as a possible wound up getting arrested a couple weeks later when he and his partner were casing banks, looking probably for same people like I was, but who were actually managers, some type of delivery guy with money. And a police officer on a motorcycle pulled them over for some kind of traffic infraction and walked up to the driver's side and leaned in and said, let me see your, and I pulled the gun on the officer, took the officer's gun and took off driving away again. The officer, though he didn't have a gun, may have had one on his motorcycle, got back on the motorcycle and chased him. And in that chase, they actually arrested those 2 individuals. Because of similarity of the crime, they put me into a lineup situation. I don't remember the exact number, but normally you have 6 to 8 people in the lineup. And I picked one of the 2 guys who were there as the guy who I thought looked like the guy, but I couldn't swear to it that he did it. Based on the scenario and the investigation that was conducted later, they found an informant, somebody who knew these people, and they admitted that the informant says these guys were doing robberies, and they admitted having pulled over a police officer. They didn't know I was an agent. But they said he had the gun, and they know they had a gun, and they threw it in the Detroit River to keep from being caught with the gun. So they never did prosecute them for my crimes, but they prosecuted them for the police officer's crime, and they both went to jail. Brand new agent, as I mentioned to you, was probably in the field, 2 or 3 weeks when this happened. So real early experience in law enforcement. But I came from the Air Force, and I was an officer with the Air Police, so I had some police background before that.
And how old were you when this happened?
Probably 22. After my tour of duty in Detroit, it was about a 2-year assignment. I was assigned to San Francisco. Back in the Bureau's days, Hoover, our boss, he had a philosophy that he wanted all his agents to be well-rounded. Well-rounded means to him living in different parts of the country. I came from Baltimore. Baltimore was considered an eastern city because it's on the East Coast, and they considered a southern city. So if you have north, south, east, west, I had the north-south by being east and south. So my first office was to Detroit, as far north as I could go, because across the river was Canada, and so they sent me to California, so that I was well-rounded, having lived in 4 different parts of the country. So anyway, I was in San Francisco, and when I was there, I was initially put on a military crime situation because it was the beginning of the Vietnam War era. So I was assigned to deserters. And then from the deserter squad, I was put on a fugitive squad. Rather than just chasing military deserters, I was chasing federal criminals. Federal criminal is somebody who commits a crime in one state and flees to another state. If you robbed the bank in Detroit and went to Chicago, they couldn't make an arrest, but federal agents could do it. So that's how I got into the fugitives. And the fugitive squad was also assigned bank robberies. So when a bank robbery went down, everybody worked together. Another crime on that squad was kidnapping. So while I was in San Francisco, across the Bay Bridge was Oakland and Berkeley, 2 major cities. And Patty Hearst, the granddaughter of the Hearst Fortune, the newspaper chain, those days probably one of the richest families in the United States, had been kidnapped on the campus of Berkeley. So I was off of my squad. The squads also had branch offices, but it was being handled by one of the branch offices in the Oakland, Berkeley area. And so I knew about the kidnapping, but I didn't work that kidnapping there. Do you want me to get into the kidnapping there, or?
Of Patty Hearst, or?
Yes.
Just explain the basic context
Okay.
of it.
Patty Hearst was a student at the University of Berkeley, and that was the liberal, radical college university of the whole country at the time. She was living off campus in an apartment and living with her boyfriend at the time. Some people went to her home one night, broke into the, not the home, but the apartment, broke into the apartment, worked over her boyfriend, took Patty and drug her out of the apartment, and they saw her being driven off in a car, and so that was the kidnapping. Sometime later, ransom notes started coming into the family, the Hearst family, saying we want money for her release. So we did know about the kidnapping. It made national news because it would be maybe something like one of Trump's kids being stolen, because that he was that important. The Hearst family basically owned a chain of newspapers from the West Coast to San Francisco all the way over to New York. So he was a big man in the news. So I was now back to San Francisco, where I was assigned as working fugitives. I was told to respond one afternoon to a bank in a section of San Francisco where there had been a bank robbery. I responded to that bank robbery, and among the things you do at bank robberies is collect evidence, anything anybody might have touched or whatever. And that bank robbery, when they ran out of the bank, they fired a bunch of guns off just to scare people away so they can get in their car and get away. So I was assigned, among other things, to collect the casings, because these were automatic weapons that would eject casings. So I collected evidence of the casings. From the video film and what happened, they identified the people being involved in a bank robbery having been the same people who did the kidnapping. And out of this whole thing, they traced the organization that was doing the kidnapping in something called the Sudanese Liberation Army. Sudanese is a word that basically says it is a morphosis of one person into another and becoming one. The leader of it was a guy by the name of Donald Weed, who was a black ex-criminal, had just gotten out of prison and had a long history of doing robberies. And apparently he had gotten into a group of people that were young radicals, and because of the anti-war sentiments back in the 60s, they envisioned causing a revolution to overthrow the whole United States government. So that was their mission, and they thought the way it would be done is to get money. And they didn't feel like going out and working for it. They started robbing banks, hence the bank robberies. The other part of the memesis was that he had made contact with about 6 other young liberals. And so they adopted as insignia a cobra, and it's a very venomous poison snake that usually raises its head and dives at things. But instead of a single head, he had 7 heads of these 7 radicals that were going to then morphosize even more so and have more and more snakes. And with those snakes would overthrow the government. Fortunately, it didn't happen because of the rest of the story. So we knew now that Patty was involved with this group, Patty Hearst. But she was still considered to have been a kidnapped person. Remember, the whole press news coverage of this was by the Hearst family, and she was the granddaughter of the guy running this whole thing. Her father was actually the one who conducted the day-to-day operations, multimillionaire, and they demanded all kind of money for her release. But these bank robberies, they were getting money, but not a great deal of money, anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a bank robbery. But when you got 7 people, and now you got Patty being an 8th, you got to feed them, you got to have hotel rooms, you got to have clothes and everything that you live off of. That is basically just keeping themselves moving, not enough to do their activities to overthrow the government. So they came to the conclusion that we could demand big ransom monies from the Hearst family. And one of the things they demanded was that the Hearst family buy $1 million worth of food, mainly meats, to be distributed in San Francisco to the black community. They thought this was a way to get the black community to rise up and join their cause. And Hearst went along with spending the money. He actually went out and bought all kind of meat products, and the demand notes that were coming in, or telephone calls, most of the time telephone calls, and the Bureau was trying to trace them, and wasn't being too successful because they were so short. There's a time sequence involved in trying to trace something. I'm still doing my own work. I'm still chasing my fugitives, chasing other bank robbers. I was not in the Patty Hearst squad. They set up a special squad for the kidnapping. So anyway, one of the episodes was that $1 million worth of these meats were delivered to the San Francisco black area. Fillmore District is what it was called. And when these trucks drove up with frozen meats, they went to like 5 or 6 different locations, and the drivers were going to hand the food out to people, as the notes said, but the streets turned out to be riots. They didn't want to wait for in line. They just mobbed. You took all you could carry and ran away with it. So there were riots at each one of these little locations over, at this point now, the stealing of the meats. But that's part of the thing. And because of bad publicity, the radical group of thinking they encouraged blacks, actually turned the blacks off on them because it didn't work out the way they had hoped. But because of this whole thing lasted about 2 or 3 years, because of the political pressure in the Bureau and bringing more and more agents into working just the kidnapping. They diverted, they had to get out of San Francisco. So basically, the CENTQ, the Liberation Army, moved and relocated down to Los Angeles. And at that time, everything went dormant. And the investigation, just all the leaves dried up. You were getting people calling in and saying, I saw. They had posters and wanted flyers, pictures of Patty Hearst. And one of the robberies, Patty Hearst shows up at the bank robbery, this time not undercover, but she comes in and announces herself holding a it's an M1 carbine, wearing a beret, and she identifies herself as Tanya. Tanya was her code name in the Liberation Army, and later on they were arguing that she had become part of a Stockholm syndrome, where when you're held a captive, you start sympathizing with the people that were your kidnappers, and that she then joined their cause against her own father and against the United States, and that she's going to be part of the revolution. And she announces herself as one of their members, and then she was starting getting some film releases of interviews that they would send in. Now they're decided they're using Patty to advance their cause because the meat situation didn't work out the way they had hoped. But they're out of the area. Part of the interesting part of the story is when they relocated down to Los Angeles, they had several different safe houses. And in case one house went bad or they have another place they could go to, or something went wrong, they had another location where they could meet. They're living all in one big communal house. Just one of the little side notes, a thing that worked, but it worked too late, was they did research, investigation on this guy, Donald Weed, the leader of the group. And they found out that he had a great passion for macadamia and plum wine. You never heard of it. I'd never heard of it before or since. But they found places where macadamia and plum wine was sold in California. And there weren't many. There might have been maybe one in every major city, but that's still in California. That's 20 or 30 places. And so they started sending agents around to any place where they sold macadamia and plum wine. And at one place in San Francisco, they actually found a dealer who remembered the radicals like we're talking about. And CENTQ himself, CENTQ was Donald Weed's code name. And we actually found the place where they were living in San Francisco, but too late, because 2 weeks earlier they had gone to Los Angeles. The whole investigation might have ended right there if we had gotten that information earlier. But it showed great investigation, but unfortunately too late. But when they were in Los Angeles, now their money is pretty well depleted. So they were doing a lot of little petty crimes. No longer the big bank robberies, but even little grocery stores and things. And one of the things they were planning to do is, rather than having safe houses, is have places where they can go out in the woods, a lot of campgrounds. So they needed to get some campground type stuff. So two of the other players are the Harrises. It's a husband and wife team, Bill and Emily Harris. Bill and Emily Harris and Patty Hearst go off in the van. They had a couple different vans that they were using because they could hide in vans. To a sporting goods store where they would get stuff so they could go hide in the woods if they had to. And Patty, since she is the most noted, stays in the van. She's got a disguise on or whatever the ladies do to change their appearances. The Harrises go across the street into the camping goods place, and Emily is buying stuff legitimately. Don't want to draw attention to her, but Bill, her husband, is basically now a crook, even though he's a young college kid. He starts shoplifting stuff, hiding it in his coat and not paying for it. Well, the owner of the store catches him. He pulls out a gun on both of them and says, "Hold it right here, I'm calling the cops." He grabs the phone and starts calling the cops. But Patty, sitting in the car, can see what's happening. And remember, she's supposed to be a kidnapped victim. She's by herself. She could have driven off by herself right then and there in the car. She had the keys and everything else. She jumps out of the car and from the street shoots up the top of the sporting goods store. And the owner, being smart now, dives under cover. The Harrises run out the door, jump in the van, and the three of them escape. Police get there, but they get there too late. But then there's a big search because they got the van, and the driver also got the tag of the car. They find the van abandoned a few blocks away, but they're gone. So Patty, the two Harrises are gone out of the picture. But they search the van, and in the van, there's a bunch of parking tickets in the glove compartment. Because wherever this van was parked, cops would come by illegal parking. Well, they didn't follow the laws anywhere. They didn't care about tickets. They were going to pay them anyway. But on the tickets, the cops wrote down the location where they were issued. And there were 2 or 3 places. And they sent police officers out to see what was at those locations where the tickets were issued. And one of them was in front of a house, big old Victorian house. And as they pull up in front of the house, they're in their marked police cars. They get out, looking around. They take gunfire from the house. So the 2 officers then take cover and call for backup. And it results in a siege now completely around this house. They evacuate people for about a 2-block area. And they probably have, 50, 100 police officers surrounding the house. They find out later that's where the Liberation Army headquarters was in Los Angeles. The shootout lasts for a couple hours, and starting to get late in the afternoon, and they don't want to have the night situation and possibility of them escaping. So they decide they're going to tear gas the place. And they did start lobbing in tear gas, and there's gunfire going on this whole time. And when the tear gas hits the old Victorian, it's an old wood house. And tear gas sometimes causes, it's red hot fire and blades. Besides the tear gas, it also has a flammable quality. The building catches fire. And the bad guys inside the Liberation Army don't want to come out. And so they take cover in a crawl space under the house while it's burning. They all die in the fire. It appears not from the fire, but because the fire sucked up the oxygen. They think they died mainly of inhalation, lack of oxygen. But they all die, and after the fire's put out and everything, they count the bodies. And I forget the exact number now, there were like 5. 3 are missing. Patty and the 2 Harrises that took off running did go back to the headquarters. They went probably to another safe house that never found that, but wherever they went, they disappeared out of the picture. But the main 2/3 of the group are now dead in this fire. And that could have been the end of the story, but Patty is still the big one. getting the most publicity, and all this is driving the story even further, because this is almost every night in the news for like 2 years. Subsequent investigation reveals that the Harrises and Patty have some rich friends that get them to Pennsylvania. So they're sent from Los Angeles undercover, presumably by vans, all the way across the country into Pennsylvania. And just slips my mind what the town was, but it was some small town outside of Philadelphia. And they hide out there for about 6 months on an old farmhouse. How should I put this in here? They find out, the Bureau finds out, that a lot of the money came from a guy by the name of Bill Walton. Bill Walton was a professional basketball player, a young college kid who went into the professional leagues, who was a radical in the same bunch. And he's involved with their cover-up. We don't know for exactly, at least I don't know on my end, exactly whether he did the driving or just did the financing. But that's how they escaped out of Los Angeles. But they still have dreams of the liberation of the whole thing. So many people say the big ringleader then became Emily Harris, was the most radical of the bunch. And she wants to go back to San Francisco and go back to their original plan of robbing banks and getting people to join the cause. And so they go back to San Francisco. Next part of the story where I actually get involved. At that point, I got 10, 12 years in, so I'm considered more of a senior agent. And in the Bureau, you have rookie agents coming in, like I was in Detroit periodically. And one of the things rookie agents have to do is make so many arrests within their first year to be certified, not actually on the documentation, but you had to have so many arrests to show you're a real agent and you can do real work. And so I was assigned rookie agents to ensure they had several arrests. And because of the fugitive work, I was mainly involved in making arrests. Take them out on a couple of arrests. And then at some point, you got to cut them loose to see if they can work on their own. So I would give them little cases to do, not major killers or robbers, more of a small petty crime type people. But we had to find them, we had to arrest them. And they went out and made a couple of the arrests. And the Patty Hearst thing is still going. We're still getting people calling in. We have to come up with ideas how to find these people. Well, back in the phase when they escaped from San Francisco the first time to go to Los Angeles, we had known that this guy Weed Sinkyu had served time in jail. And they went around to where he was in prison a couple times, and one time he had been arrested over in the Oakland-Berkeley area and held there pending trial. And among the many little things, and I'm not going to tell you all of what we do everything conceivable to find people. But when you're in jail, people can come visit you, and they keep a visitor log. Generally, you have to sign your name and show some kind of identification. So they go over there and they find, when he was in jail, 2 or 3 people came to visit him. And one of the ladies that came to visit him was a Oriental lady by the name of Wendy Yashimura, Japanese name, who was a student at Berkeley, and again with these radicals. We found out that she had had a warrant out, some small warrant, and that was one of the people that I had signed these agents to go work on. Don't want to give them the names because I don't have permission to use them, but we'll just say one guy was Ray and Bill. And so they go out and do some investigation, and they find from credit bureau checks and things like this that Wendy Yashimura is now living in San Francisco. And they came up with an address that they thought was good. And they went out to the address and they did a little surveillance out of a car, just in the street, looking for an Oriental lady going into this particular house. This particular house was about a half a block from an intersection with a park on that corner. So they're watching the house for an Oriental lady. They don't see one, but they see a couple coming out, a younger couple, we're talking people in their early 20s, a white girl and a white guy coming out, turning, going up to the corner, and jogging around the park. So they jog around the park, go back into the house, and didn't really pay much attention to it. So it is like 2 or 3 days. And they take notice now, after you own it and you got glasses and things, that these two people look like Bill and Emily Harris. They come back and tell me about it. I'm not a supervisor, but I'm in the chain of command. They're reporting to me. And then I go to my supervisor and he drags me down with the two guys to the squad handling the Patty Hearst kidnapping. And these are senior agents. These are guys that now have been around 35, 40 years. And we tell them the story. And unfortunately, in the world of real life, rookies don't have a great credibility until they prove themselves. And nobody wanted to say, hey, kids, you don't know what you're talking about. But that's what they said. And go get us some pictures. All right, so we leave. Remember, these guys are under me, so I got to help them do whatever they have to do and logical stuff. The Bureau has a couple vans with camera facilities where you could actually take the pictures that they said, let's get some pictures. So we get the van, I drive them in, park the van so it was close enough that they could see the door of the house, and park it and leave with the two rookie agents in the back of the van. And we did it early enough that it was still dark, so nobody spotted me or anything. So they're in the van, and sure enough, that same morning, they come out, the couples, and jog around the park. And among the other things we did is they got pictures. But before we got to the van story, I left one thing out, is that I went out there with them, and we also surveilled a couple blocks away, and we saw them come out, at least two people, male and female, come out. We couldn't see them close enough to get a picture or anything. We tried it for a car before the van. And we followed them to another house where they stayed for a couple hours, short distance away, the other part of the town. So we knew that they had a connection to another address, very significant later. But since they only stayed there a couple minutes and then went back to their plane, we didn't put a great credibility of them there. We wanted to get these pictures. We got the pictures, and I didn't develop them. We got a place that does our developing, and we got our pictures. And it's the Harrises, no question of it. You got the poster here, the wanted flyer, and you got the pictures. We go back to the old timers, who special agent in charge, the boss, he's there, show them the pictures, and sure enough, these are the Harrises. So they have to have a big rest to get them. So in the course of the investigation, I don't know if he's stopping, keep going? Okay. In the course of the investigation, he says, here's the plan. After they decide what's going to happen, they get about 50 agents. They come out and they go jogging. So don't want to take them in the house because it's more dangerous than if they come out jogging. They're not going to be carrying weapons. At least that's the presumptions. and we'll arrest them in the park, and then we'll attack the house, see what's in the house. They were hoping that Patty would still be hiding in the house. So this is all planned that morning. We got the agents all surrounded around the park, covering all the corners. We got people in cars that are going to grab them, take them right away. Then whoever else would attack the house. I take pride in saying, I said, well, what about if they go the other way? And then they said, oh, that's a good idea. You and one of the rookies go down and block the other end of the street in case they go that way. Ha ha ha. You know, it's your idea, so you do it. And so I am not in the park area where the rest are going to be. I'm going to be in this other end of the street. That morning, sure enough, they come out of the house to go jogging. They don't turn right and go to the park. They turn left, where I am sitting down there with just a rookie. And so I said, you want me to take them? The battle plan was not to take them that close to the house. They said, no, don't do anything. Let them go. So we're in a car, but we kind of try to make it not obvious. They jog past us and leave the scene. And for about 15 minutes, nobody knows where they're at. If they had spotted me, my partner, or what was happening at the park, they were gone. But just lucked out. They didn't see anything, and they're coming back now from their jog. And this is a little side street, so it's enough for a car parked on each direction, and maybe one car going up the middle. When they're coming back, Bill is about a block in front of his wife, Emily. I guess she's more winded or whatever. So they're coming back. So Bill passes me. Now he's between me, the house, and the park where all the other agents are hiding. Emily is still coming back. They don't want to take him in the house because it's more dangerous. So he's got weapons in there and you got a problem. Especially after the shootout in Los Angeles. So they said, we can't let him get in the house. As soon as he steps, the house has got a basement and 2 floors. So there's steps up to the first floor. And they said, as soon as he puts his foot on that step, we're going to move in and take him going into the house. When that happens, Emily is now just past my car because of the delay time. They grab Bill before he gets up the steps. But Emily sees all this happening, turns around and runs the opposite direction, where I and my rookie partner make the arrest on her. And that goes down. But as soon as these arrests are made, we have agents in cars that swoop by, they're handcuffed right at the spot, thrown in the car, and they're taken away. And now we have to get into the house. Well, these houses in San Francisco are rectangles with no alleys. There is an alley type thing that separates the house, the backyard, the alleyway, a backyard, another house. But there's no way that you can get into that alley. So they're trying to get in the front door. What I did is went to the next door, banged on the door, the lady let me in, and I went through her house into the backyard and covered the backyard. So I was out in the backyard by myself. By that time they kicked in the door and they're coming in, they're searching the house. And I had the back door, and we know nobody ran out the back door. Nobody's in the house. Where's Patty? No idea. Where's Wendy? No idea. You might remember what I forgot to mention to you, we followed them to a second house where they went in one time and they came back out. Since we have all these agents, we send agents to the other location they bang on the door, and the Oriental girl, Emily, Wendy Yashimura, opens the door. She's arrested at the door right away. And when all this is happening, they look up the steps. It's, again, these Victorian houses in San Francisco. Up at the top of the staircase is Patty Hearst. They demand she comes down. She doesn't resist. She comes downstairs. They cuff her. Search the house. That's the only two people in the house. And one of the interesting part of the stories, from my point of view, they were still considering Patty to be a kidnapped victim. And they said to her, Patty, is there anything we can do for you before we take you? You're going to have to come to court and go jail with us. And she says one thing: can I change my pants? Because she was very scared. So draw your own conclusions why she wanted to change her pants. We're back to the house, the original house that I was surveilling with the rookies. They start going through a real search. Now, you know, one thing is you're searching a room looking for a body. You're looking for where somebody could be hiding in a closet, under a bed, things like this. But you still have to go through every drawer, everything in this place for evidence. So they bring in like 2 or 3 agents to search each room, and there might have been 8 rooms in the house. And the guy goes into one room and says, "Get the hell out of here. It's full of explosives, weapons, it's a gun vault," including, remember, part of what they were doing also is setting off bombs. So they had bomb-making equipment. And you didn't know if this building was booby-trapped. But because of the situation, they say 2 things. We got to get a search warrant to do a real search now, because we got stuff in this house. And also, it's a danger to the whole block, because boom, the whole block could go up. I was still a young kid in those days and didn't pay attention. But the 2 rookies that I worked with and I were assigned to stay in the house till they got the search warrant to make sure nothing was disturbed. But we weren't allowed to look around at anything. And it took them probably 6 to 8 hours to get us a search warrant. You could get a verbal search warrant in those days, but if you wanted to get details, you had to put all the particulars about what we had seen, and the agent who went in there and saw the explosives and stuff. So he had to do a write-up and interview, and then he had to go talk to the judge along with the other people. So we're just sitting in the living room. We did turn the TV on. We were watching TV. And remember, this is all going now from like 9 o'clock in the morning. So we're talking probably 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We had something to eat before, no lunch. And here it's 8, 9 o'clock at night. We're waiting for the search warrant. So it's time to eat. So I don't know it. Well, I actually know it because the whole block was sealed off. They evacuated people, and press was all over the place. But our car, remember, was the one parked just right up the street. So my car is out there. So I come out, it's dark, but I just come out of the house, get in my car, and go off to a McDonald's, get a McDonald's, come back, park in the same place, and go into the house. And my wife and neighbors are watching all this stuff on TV because she knows I was working that day. And they have me on the news and captioned, "FBI agent carries mysterious package back into the house." That's a bag of McDonald's. And we eat our sandwiches, and then the search warrant comes in, and then we spend the next couple hours, and I had one of the rooms to search. Didn't find anything really significant. But we did find all the evidence, and that all got into court. And so, because Patty was in the bank robberies and the whole scenario, they decided they're going to charge her not as a victim, but as a conspirator. And there are several things that we knew from the investigation that really didn't come out in the court. It probably was significant in why the Bureau did what it did in charging her. The Bureau believes everything police officers tell us, and we take their investigation as being a valid investigation, but we still like to do our own. So even though the initial kidnapping scene in Berkeley, where Patty was drug out of her apartment, was done by the police, the Bureau went back and did its own. Because we look for some things that the police officers don't look for. In this apartment, there was 2 large bookcases full of books. I don't know if you guys, if you're college kids, so you might know that if you move anything, books are the heaviest thing in the world to move. One of the trademarks of the SLA, Simulation Liberation Army, they didn't only want to overthrow the government, they wanted to kill police officers. And they figured they would be in some shootouts. So one of their code things, and they publicized this, they would take their bullets, cartridges, to get the cartridge casing and the bullet head. They would cut an X in the top of the bullet head, making a sort of a homemade dum-dum. A dum-dum, when a bullet hits you, it goes in a little hole and then blows out the back. But if you cut your point, it makes your head spread so the hole going in is going to be bigger.
That's why
But
made
they,
point.
right, but that was not enough for them, so they took and poured arsenic into the cut point. Apparently the scientists say it would have really dried up and would not have really made anything happen. But they advertised that not only we're going to shoot you with this arsenic bullets that are going to kill you. Even if you don't die from the wound, you're going to die from the poison. But that was their code name. Well, one of the things in the search, the Bureau goes back to this apartment, takes out every book, looks through every book, and moves the bookcase. And there's a little section behind the bookcase. They find a box of ammunition with the little hollow point cuts with the arsenic. The boyfriend who got beat up, they did all kind of polygraphs interview to make sure he was not part of the kidnapping way back when. And there was no indication that he was ever involved in it. Now, answer the question for me. Where did those bullets come from? Remember, they were in and out of this kidnapping in about 10 minutes. Somebody in that apartment had to be part of the gang. Because those bullets were put in, and it took the agents probably half an hour or more to move all that stuff to get behind it. FBI had informants on college campuses, and somebody came in and said they had seen Patty at some of the radical meetings. The supposition by many, and I believe I'm one of them, that she was involved in this whole thing. It wasn't a kidnapping. It was a planned attempt to get money from her father, but she didn't know it. When they drug her out of the apartment, they beat her boyfriend up, but he remembers, and some other people in the apartment remember her hollering. Right? If I was kidnapping you guys, would you scream and holler if somebody's dragging you out? The quote was, "What was she saying?" And the reply was, "No, no, not me. No, no, not me." What does that mean?
There was someone else.
Somebody knew we're going to do a kidnapping, but we're not going to take somebody else. We're going to do this, but I didn't know I was the one, I was in the planning, I'm going to be the victim. But look at yourself from the kidnapper's point of view. if you kidnap a real person, they're going to try to escape. They're going to try to turn evidence against you and everything else. But if you're one of the gang, you got nothing to fear. But they never told her that was their plan until after it was over. And that, along with some of her actions in the bank robbery thing, was part of the reason she was charged. Let me back up and tell you another one of the aspects. Among the banks that they robbed, they wanted to show that the whole of California was going up in these rebellions. So they also did a couple bank robberies out in Sacramento. Now, if California is a long state. Remember, there are only 3 states on the West Coast. California takes up like 2/3 of the whole West Coast. So they got word in Los Angeles, they were in San Francisco. Sacramento is inland going towards the Nevada border. So they did a bank robbery there. When they went into that bank robbery, bank had customers in the bank, and based on all the evidence that they acquired, Patty was at that bank robbery, and Emily Harris was carrying a gun. And in that robbery, whether intentionally or accidentally, she cranks off a round in the bank. And there's a lady customer at the counter who gets hit and drops. They do the robbery and they take off. Police get there, the ambulances get there, they took the lady immediately to the closest hospital, where they rush her into an operating ward. She's hurt severely. And they call STAT, or whatever the code name is, get the doctors down to the operating room immediately. First doctor arrives, and his wife's on the table, and she dies. So part of the sad part of the story. Let me go back a little bit more to me. When the Patty Hearst trial actually starts, again, another 6 months later, I am called as a witness in the case. The Hearsts wanted to protect their daughter. They hired the most noted lawyer in the country at the time, F. Lee Bailey. You kids might not know anything about him, but he was the biggie. Most expensive, best track record, the whole thing. And his defense was, yeah, she did all these things, but she didn't do it willingly. She was this Stockholm thing. And she wasn't involved in the bank robbery in her bright mind. She was doing it because of fear of the brainwashing. And the jury didn't buy it because she was convicted. But I did get called to testify. I mentioned to you at that bank robbery in San Francisco, which was their first bank robbery, I had gone out and collected up the cartridges. Well, when you do that, you prepare a document, the evidence, and the evidence gets submitted into the court. And somehow they got some fingerprints off of some of those cartridges, and they could prove these people were the ones that did the robbery. And so I had to testify, got into the jury room, got sworn in, and after they asked me my name, rank, serial number to get me into the witness part, Bailey, the big lawyer, says, what's he going to testify to? I said, picking up the cartridges. He said, we'll stipulate to that. That means they'll take my statement as is my testimony. So I didn't even actually have to answer any question other than who I was. And I was relieved, and that was the end of my testimony. So I was only on the stand for maybe 2 minutes. No questions at all about my part of the arrest or anything like that. After she was convicted, they have to have a press release, and the jury goes out on a weekend, and they didn't expect the jury to come back. And that day, On a Saturday and Sunday, the Bureau has somebody answering telephones in case anything happens over the weekend. And they always have an agent assigned to duty. I was the agent on duty at the office when the court called back, said the jury's coming back in. Though they had a whole squad following this stuff, it was a weekend, everybody went home. Nobody was there. I was the only guy. It was, I believe it was a Saturday or Sunday, forget the date. So I called the boss and said, the jury's coming back in. They say in about 10 minutes. And the boss says, somebody's got to be there. So you go down so I was in the courtroom when the jury brought the verdict back in. And just so happens, as a fluke, the same thing happened about another 6 months later when they were doing a sentencing, because they have a sentencing report that has to be done before you sentence somebody after a conviction. And I was there at the sentencing report for the same way, so I had about 4 episodes in a whole investigation. Patty is convicted. She is sent to prison. Strange thing happened, though. Remember, we're talking big money here. She gets bail from prison, which is unheard of. Bail during trial time before you're convicted happens. But she was placed under house arrest at home rather than in a prison. And then she later gets a pardon by Jimmy Carter, who was president. And this is another little side note. While she's under house arrest, they have to have guards on her, make sure she doesn't flee. And they put a guy in charge of it from the Secret Service detail who winds up later marrying her. So Patty is now a decent citizen, respectable like her father, but from my point of view, guilty of sin. But
And so the agent that was shot in his car,
McLean killed himself rather than being arrested. After he was pronounced dead, his body was also to be moved to Baltimore for an autopsy, because again, all homicides in Maryland have to go to the coroner's office in Baltimore. Because of the evidence and chain of custody of the evidence, I was assigned to accompany his body to Baltimore. So I followed the ambulance that was taking the car back to the coroner's office in Baltimore. And upon getting to the coroner's office, which is part of the University of Maryland complex, the autopsy room had several tables, and they were still working on Agent McLean when I arrived with, Agent Christensen when I arrived with McLean. And so I was assigned to make the reports from the FBI's point of view, document called FD 302 interview statement, but it also documents things, both autopsies. So I was there for the autopsy of both the victim and the killer back to back, and spent the rest of that evening at the autopsies before I wound up going home the next day. Christensen was a national hero and received the full honors of the Bureau in the United States government on his departure for his funerals, and unfortunately he left a wife and a family in a sad situation all the way around. So the mind has a tendency not to want to remember things that are bad and sad, and for some reason I really don't have a lot of recollection, whether it's been purged or whatever. A sad story that I don't like talking about. Okay. Earlier in the discussion of what else that I might have done significantly, another incident out of the Silver Spring Resident Agency occurred in the 2002 area. Uh, all the stories we're talking about are things that made national news, not just local news, but I did things similar fashions that are not quite as important and not as much publicity as the ones I'm talking about. But in 2002, there was a thing that made the news pretty regularly for a couple months anyway, referred to commonly as the DC sniper murders. It involved a guy by the name of Lee Malvo, and the actual shooter. There were a guy by the name of John Muhammad. John Muhammad was a long-time petty criminal. Came out of the deep south. Was down anywhere from Florida or across to Arizona, New Mexico, and Alabama area. He did one or two killings there, and he came up to D.C. Lee Malvo was a young teenage kid that kind of looked at him as a father-type figure, and the two of those started killing people. Apparently, he has initially planned to just kill his wife, but it, some reason, kept expanding it, and he thought that if he just killed his wife, people would catch on to him very quickly. Because when there's a homicide, generally it's done by somebody who knows the person very well. So he was going to cover it by having a series of sniper-type killings, so it would look like she was just a random the victim, rather than the person that was targeted by him. So he did some killings in that area, and then came up into the, when I say this DC area, there were some in Virginia, some in Maryland, and some in the District of Columbia as well. But about once a month for a couple months he was shooting somebody. Most of the times he was doing it with a sniper rifle, so they were usually fatal fatalities, not wounds. And because of the way they were done at random, the whole community, the District of Columbia area, was kind of panic-stricken, because you never knew what happened. Sometimes it would be a lady pumping gas at a gas station. Sometimes somebody just standing in a bus station. You never knew.